Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for prioritizing food safety on this Tuesday morning and joining us for the third of our April food safety webinars covering the FSMA produce safety rule for Idaho. I'm Ariel Agenbrad. I'm a University of Idaho Extension educator. I am going to be your host and presenter for today's webinar. So we'll get started. This is part 2 of our effective worker training webinars. Part 1 was a couple weeks ago. I know some of you were on that one live, and if you weren't, you can still access that one through a recording, and we'd be happy to send you out more information if you missed that one. We'll review a little bit about what was covered in that webinar, and then we'll move into the content for today's, which is really taking it to that next level and putting it into practice on your farm. So effective worker training, part 2, the who, what, when, and how to train to meet the requirements of the produce safety rule. And I should mention that this project is in collaboration with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture's Produce Safety Program. They are a regulatory partner, and we have a few representatives on the webinar today. So when we get to question and answer, hopefully we will be able to have them on hand to answer any questions that I might not be able to answer. All right, and remember to, you've got the chat and the Q&A both where you can give feedback, ask questions, and join in the virtual conversation. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be emailed out to you when we are finished. All right, let's get going. Just a couple quick webinar housekeeping tips. Most of you are old pros at this now, but if you are having any issues, try closing the other programs that are currently running on your computer. If you're having problems with sound, you can check your microphone in Zoom. You can switch it. Sometimes that makes a difference. Be careful not to click something that will take you out of sound like I just did. Again, if you have questions, you can put them into the question box or the chat. I'm watching both of them. We will be sending out handouts following the webinar. I can't link handouts and be sharing my screen at the same time. So you'll get a follow-up email once the recording has posted and I've put all of the files into an email. And then just to mention that this webinar and Q&A will not discuss COVID-19 related produce safety questions. We are going to be focused on the FSMA produce safety rule. So our goals for today's webinar, we hope that after participating, you're going to feel better prepared to review the required training for all workers on covered farms, identify what additional worker training needs you might have on your farm, find resources to effectively teach your workers what is required, and keep records of worker training that are in compliance with the FSMA produce safety rule requirements. Just to review again, the basics of the Food Safety Modernization Act. We call it FSMA for short. It was signed into law on January 4th, 2011. We really can't call it a new rule after that. We've got 4-H kids older than FSMA now. This gives the FDA the authority to regulate food from farm to fork, and it was really the first sweeping food safety regulation overhaul since about 1938, so it was probably due. What the produce safety rule does, it's one of the 7 FSMA rules. It establishes science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables for human consumption. And this is really in response in a lot of ways to the number of outbreaks of foodborne illness and death that are traced back to fresh produce that's consumed raw. All farms, both foreign and domestic, must comply with the produce safety rule and other aspects of FSMA where applicable. In Idaho, the Idaho State Department of Agriculture is the agency that holds the regulatory authority, conducts inspections of covered farms, and verifies exemptions, because yes, there are some exemptions. Not all farms are subject to the produce safety rule, and some are going to be eligible for a qualified exemption. We're not going into those details today. If you still don't know where you fall in terms of coverage by the rule, we do have a decision tool. It's linked there, and it'll be linked when the slides come out. And that's an online anonymous tool that helps you determine the most likely level of coverage for your farm and where you belong. In FSMA, in the produce safety rule, we are looking particularly today at subpart C, section 112.22. This is personnel qualifications and training. And basically this covers the training requirements for anybody on the farm who handles produce or food contact surfaces. That is any surface that comes in contact with food. It also covers the supervisor requirements and the training record requirements. So this is what we would refer back to as we are going through today's presentation. And I do have the rule sitting here next to me, so maybe you do too if you're that kind of learner. So if your farm is covered by the produce safety rule, you must comply with subpart C in order to be in compliance with the rule. But even if your farm is not covered, maybe you are under even the initial sales threshold or you qualify for a qualified exemption, there is still significant value in training your employees. We talked about that a little bit 2 weeks ago about making sure that everyone is on the same page, that they're following the principles and practices that you value on your farm and doing things the way that you would do them if you're not there. So think about this even if you are not required to keep records on training your employees, and think about why it might be a good idea. So some of this is going to be a little bit of review from the webinar 2 weeks ago, but in case you weren't on, it's very important because this really sets up why we're having this conversation today. So who must be trained? So all personnel who handle produce or food contact surfaces must receive training upon hiring. This includes all personnel, temporary, part-time, seasonal, as well as contracted personnel. So even if they're not your employees, if they're coming onto your farm to handle covered produce or food contact surfaces, they must be trained. And all of these folks, as well as those who supervise these personnel, must have the combination of education, training, and experience necessary to perform their duties. And they're not only going to receive training upon hiring. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Right now, actually, training must be repeated annually and as needed if observations or information indicate that personnel are not meeting your standards. And your training must cover the principles of food safety, worker health and hygiene, and any applicable requirements of the produce safety rule. So upon hire, every year thereafter, or as needed more frequently if you're seeing that things are not being done to your standard or not meeting the standards of the produce safety rule. And this is really what we covered 2 weeks ago when we talked about how to reach your learners, how people learn in general. Training must be conducted in a manner that is easily understood by your learners. So that maybe mean the language, the style of training, the way that the information is conveyed. And you must keep records of training that document that the required training, that documents that the required training happened, and including the date of training, topics covered, and persons trained. And we're going to get into this section a lot more today. But just know that talking about the training in a manner that's easily understood, that was really the focus of webinar part 1. We also shared with you a little bit of feedback about how Idaho farms are doing in terms of their worker training and their record keeping. So remember, these are anonymous reports. This does not identify any particular farm. These are just the results from our inspectors on what they saw and what observations they cited when they were doing inspections. So more than once, we saw the failure to train labor that was contracted from another farm on the inspected farm's requirements. So it may be that the contract labor was trained, but they weren't trained on your particular farm's requirements. So that is something that they saw as a deficit. Our inspectors also saw failure to provide records of training for current employees. So this one is a little bit more common, unfortunately, that the records of trainings were not being presented or kept. Sometimes there was failure to provide any records for any employees. And then based on what inspectors were seeing, there was evidence that the employees were not following the required practices. Now, last time we talked about how that could be that they were not receiving any training, or maybe that the training was not effective. But today we're really focused on these first three, right? What are we training? The trainings are happening. How are we documenting those trainings? Because if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And that's really the where we have to go with regard to record keeping and inspection. So I wanted to review this really quickly, just so you can be thinking about it in context as we talk about the different things that need to be trained today. So what were those best practices we discussed for training adult learners? Well, we need to motivate our learners, right? What is really their motivation for learning the material? Is it to do better at their job? Is it to keep their job? Is it because they care about the farm and they care about the customers? Find that motivation and tap into it. Acknowledge your learners' knowledge, skills, and life experience that they bring to work. It could be that knowledge, skill, and life experience needs to be updated. It could be that really is something very powerful that they bring. Make your trainings relevant and practical, right? We know that some of this may not initially seem as relevant, but we hope that once you start getting into it, it really will be. Respect the individual learner. Present trainings that complement multiple learning styles. So we talked about the visual learner, the learner that learns by seeing and reading, the learner that interprets information best when it is heard or spoken. And then the learners that do best when they're actually able to practice and do what it is that's being taught, so those tactile learners. So the best training is going to incorporate at least one aspect from each of those different learning styles to reach the most learners. Accommodate differences. So whether these are differences in learning and ability, literacy, language, make sure, again, that those trainings are easy to understand. And then check for comprehension, whether you ask them to repeat back to you or demonstrate, or even throw in a pop quiz. We talked about that too. And then we want to model what we teach. So these should be things that you're not only training your employees on, but that you are doing yourself every day, and that are part of your farm's culture and your everyday practices and your standard operating procedures. So make that really practice what you preach. All right, are we ready to get our hands dirty? Even though we're talking about hygiene, I just thought this was a good picture for that. All right, what are we digging into today? So really, we're looking at the specifics on what to train in order to be in compliance with the produce safety rule. We're talking about personalizing training for your farm or operation. We're going to give you some things to think about and give you some time to think about what additional topics are going to go into training on your farm. We'll go over very specifically the record keeping that's required related to worker training. And then we will also share with you what we think are some of the best tools, templates, and resources out there to help you implement trainings more efficiently. And we'll also talk about some potential tools and templates that are in the works and get your feedback on how to make those the best that they can be for Idaho and be the most useful to you. All right, so let's go back to the rule now. Let's go back and look at, again, what needs to be taught to your employees at minimum. So here are the worker training requirements, right? We said our workers must be trained upon hire, and then that training must be repeated annually, so every year. Training must be repeated if you observe or learn that your workers are not meeting your standards. So, how are you going about determining that standards are not being met? And at what point does it then trigger that more training needs to happen? Any workers handling covered produce or food contact surfaces and the people that supervise them must be trained. So these are the who's, right? And training must be easily understood by your workers. What does the training have to cover? Well, at a very minimum, the training needs to cover principles of personal health and hygiene, principles of food safety, symptoms of health conditions that could result in contamination by workers, and specific training related to growing, harvesting, packing, etc. We're going to get into each of these a little bit more here in just a few minutes. And then any other relevant produce safety rule requirements that apply to the work that that employee is doing, they need to be trained on it. So this really gives you that snapshot. Now, if we want to look at it in a little bit simpler way, here we've got our 4 squares, right? All workers who are dealing with produce must receive training that addresses the principles of food safety and hygiene, the importance of health and personal hygiene for visitors and all personnel, right? And this includes recognizing those symptoms of a health condition that is likely to result in contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces. So knowing why we're doing this and knowing what to be looking for and what health issues could actually result in contamination of produce. And I just realized that I spelled receive wrong. I apologize. And again, your training must include standards that go through subpart C through O of the produce safety rule that may apply to an employee's job responsibilities. So that's kind of your wild card. That's going to be different from farm to farm, but the box that's gold and the box that's gray, these are going to be the same for every produce farm. And just as an example, if we go into subpart D, this is where it actually is defined what hygienic practices must personnel use. So this gives you a clue as to what needs to be trained to meet subpart C, right? It's found in subpart D, and that's just in one of the subparts that follow C that have something to do with worker training. So personnel must maintain adequate personal cleanliness to protect against contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces. They must avoid contact with animals other than working animals. And there are more specifics in each of these 3 points in subpart D. And it talks about washing hands thoroughly, including scrubbing with soap or another effective surfactant and running water. Right, so here are some of those real specifics. If you're like, I don't know what hygienic practices I must teach. Well, here they are. And if you don't have a copy of the rule, if you went through one of our Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings, you will have a manual, and the rule is there in the back of the manual. It's also online. And then if you've been through our trainings, you've received a pocket size printout of the rule. And if you're missing any of those things, please reach out to us and we will make sure that you have what you need. So here's a sample checklist of putting these things into a little bit more organized fashion. So these would be the required items of training for all workers who are handling covered produce or food contact surfaces. So number 1, the principles of food safety and hygiene. Next, the importance of health and personal hygiene for all personnel on the farm and visitors. So how do you recognize symptoms of a health condition that is reasonably likely to result in contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces with the microorganisms of public health significance? So if you've been through our Produce Safety Alliance grower training, we spend a lot of time talking about the different microorganisms that we're worried about, whether it's Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. And we talk about some of the symptoms that someone might be experiencing, including fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and jaundice that we should be watching out for. And if someone is exhibiting those symptoms and they come in contact with produce or food contact surfaces, then there is a reasonable likelihood that potentially contamination will occur. So this is a major point of training in your worker training. Next would be maintaining adequate personal cleanliness to protect against contamination of covered produce and food contact surfaces. So some of the next items are how we would do that adequate personal cleanliness. So washing your hands thoroughly, including scrubbing with soap or another effective surfactant, and running water, not funning water. I really need to double check all my slides. Running water, and remember, if we go back to our Produce Safety Alliance grower training, the temperature is not as important as the quality of that water. It needs to be potable water, water that is free from any detectable generic E. coli. And they need to dry their hands thoroughly using a single serve towel, sanitary towel service, electric hand dryer, or other adequate hand drying device. Employees must wash their hands before starting work, before putting on gloves, after using the toilet, upon return to workstation after any break or other absence from the workstation, and as soon as practical after touching any animals, including livestock and working animals, or any waste of animal origin, and at any time when the hands may have become contaminated in a manner that is reasonably likely to lead to contamination of covered produce with known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. And apart from the typos, this is text that is taken from the rule. So these are the things that employees need to know. They need to know that they are not to eat, chew gum, or use tobacco products in an area that's used for a covered activity. However, drinking beverages is permitted in designated areas. Following glove, hairnet, and jewelry policies if applicable, and it's very highly recommended that you have these policies on your farm. Also, they need to be trained on how to report illness or injury. What is the chain of command? How do they do that once they've recognized it, and to make sure that that is in place. And then we'll talk about this in a little bit, but those additional standards established by FDA in subparts C through O of the produce safety rule that are applicable to the employee's job responsibilities. Now that could be a few things, it could be a lot of things, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. But these boxes up here in the white, these are the key items that need to be included in every onboarding and annual training for workers who handle covered produce or food contact surfaces and their supervisors. Okay. So something else to think about too, and this just is also part of subpart C, is that all workers who conduct harvest activities must receive specific training as well. And that is very particularly outlined in the rule. So anybody that is harvesting, right? So they must recognize when covered produce must not be harvested, right? So what are the standards for produce that should be left in the field, not harvested? And also they need to be trained on how to inspect harvest containers and equipment to ensure that they are functioning properly, cleaned, and maintained. And they also must receive all the additional prior training, but this is the training that also goes along with harvest workers. So be thinking about that too. If your harvesters are coming from a contract source, or they are not regular employees on your farm, they need to have the training. They also need to be able to know how to correct problems with harvest containers or equipment, or to report such problems to the supervisor or other responsible party, right? So if they inspect a harvest container or equipment and find that it is not functioning properly, it is not clean or properly maintained, they need to know what to do about that. How do they go back and talk to someone about it? How do they fix it before they begin harvesting? And so here's that just in a table again, right? So if we have persons who are conducting harvest activities, they have to recognize they have to recognize when covered produce must not be harvesting. And this may be including covered produce that has been contaminated with a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. Big example there would be fecal material, right? Don't harvest poop, don't pick poop. Inspecting those harvest containers and equipment to ensure they're functioning properly, clean, and maintained, so they don't become a source of contamination of the covered produce with, again, that known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. And then again, correcting problems with the harvest containers or equipment, or reporting these problems to the supervisor as appropriate to their job responsibilities. And then again, I put this in here too, training for your supervisor or responsible party. This is another part of subpart C that covers the training of all employees. And if you are on this webinar, chances are you are the person that falls into this category, and most likely you have already completed this required training. And so that successful completion of a food safety training that's at least equivalent to that received under standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA. And right now they recognize the Produce Safety Alliance grower training as that standardized curriculum that is adequate. So if you have been through that training, then you meet the requirements of this section of the rule. All right, so those were the requirements for all employees on the farm who are working with covered produce, whether in a harvest or packing environment. Now I want you to take a little bit of time and reflect on your own operation, right? So what potentially covered activities are occurring? And what activities are your workers engaged in doing? So you might write off, say, okay, well, they're involved in harvesting, or they're involved in packing. Okay, but what else? What else earlier in the season? What about, throughout the growing season? What are they doing? What are the different activities that happen on your farm? Some of them may be covered by the rule, some of them may not. And just to give you some examples of things you might want to be thinking about or where you would look for some of this information. So the covered activities, right, are the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of any covered produce. And subpart A, section 112.1, the very start of the produce safety rule, defines what covered produce is, and it defines these activities. So if there's any question about what's happening on your farm, start there. Are you using pre-harvest and post-harvest agricultural water in any way? So again, that may be something that your workers need to receive training on, right? Whether it's how to inspect a water source, how to take a water sample, depending on what they are doing on the farm. If you're using any biological soil amendments of animal origin, right? So if you're using any manures, if you're using any composts, if you have animals on the farm, I think I get to that here in a minute, then are they trained on how to avoid contamination? Are they trained on how to wash their hands or to sanitize equipment going between these different activities? Are you farming with working animals? Right? Not as common in Idaho, though in some parts of the country, there are still draft animals that are used in the fields. This one is a little bit more likely in Idaho, and that would be farming in the presence of wild and domesticated animals. So where are the animals? Is there the potential for animal intrusion? And therefore your workers are trained to watch for those signs of when deer or birds or other animals have entered the fields and potentially left fecal matter. Or do you have domesticated animals on the farm? Maybe you are an integrated operation that has both livestock and crops. How do you keep these areas separate? How do you keep these activities separate? How do you avoid potential contamination of your covered produce when you're raising livestock? And then even down to working livestock dogs or pets or things like that. How are those animals around the farm? And what are the risks and what are you looking out for? Are your employees involved in maintaining your building's equipment and tools? If so, do they understand the parts of the rule that apply to those activities? Whether it's inspecting, cleaning and sanitizing, etc. And are they supervising other employees? Well, then they do need to know what they're expected to know and what they're expecting their employees to know and do. So any of these things happening on your farms, maybe you're taking notes today, maybe you're just jotting a few things down. Thinking about this is a really important step. And then maybe your employees too are involved in keeping records. So do they might need the training on which records have to be kept and how those records are to be maintained. So just give you a second to think about this. And then we will go on to what we do with this information. And there might be something else that I am missing. So feel free to type into the chat if there are other covered activities that you would want to be putting on your list. And this is where I might call out any of our participants that are inspectors to be thinking about this and to be sharing if there's something that I'm not addressing. All right, so why is this an important first step? Why am I asking you to do this and giving you a little bit of time to do that? Well, that is because, as I've mentioned before, workers must be trained on the specific duties that are related to not only working with covered produce, covered food contact surfaces, and supervision of these tasks, but any other activities that happen on the farm that are covered by the rule. And these are going to be unique to every farm, to every commodity, to the way in which the farming is conducted. And so the risks associated with these different activities are going to be very particular to your farm, to your crop, and to your systems. And so, this goes back to when we talk about having a farm food safety plan, right? Really identifying what we do on our farm, what are our policies and principles on this farm. This is going to come right back to now, what do employees need to be trained on? And where do you find that information on what to train? It might be already in your farm food safety plan, in your standard operating procedures. And if you don't have those yet, well, you've got the produce safety rule, you've got your Grower Alliance training to fall back on to remind yourself of what things need to be covered within these different aspects. And we don't have time today to go into every subpart and pull out the individual pieces related to training, but we'll give you some places to look for that, and we might address a couple of these. All right, and this is also an important first step, because you may be the first one to introduce your workers to concepts about food safety and the produce safety rule. They may have not been involved in this before, or they might have come from, a farm that had a gap audit, that was really engaged in food safety, but they didn't know some of the more particulars of the produce safety rule. You also hopefully now know best the sources of foodborne pathogens and routes of contamination that happen on your farm, whether that's animals to produce, or people to produce, or animals to people to produce, right? What are those routes? What are those risks? And then you're the one who should really know what preventative and corrective measures you've decided should be used on your farm. And again, thinking back to the grower trainings, where we end every section talking about, what could go wrong, what you would do on your farm to correct that. So again, maybe you've already spent the time thinking about this, and this should be what goes into your training. So taking the time to really look at what happens on your farm, what you already have in existence in terms of policies and standard procedures, etc., is going to really help you to personalize your worker training. I'm going to share some examples that are very general, and maybe that works for you. Maybe your operation is pretty straightforward, pretty streamlined. Workers are just doing a couple things and they're done. But especially if you have a smaller farm or a more complex, diversified farm, there are going to be a lot of things that are really particular to how you do things. So taking that training from the standard, what we're telling you have to train, and really making it fit your farm and the workers on your farm. So I would hope that this is where you're headed, is a training that best reflects what happens on your farm and how you want things done. All right, so I had those checklists before. Here are a few that you might want to fill out, right, if you had the opportunity. So looking at some of the different things that happen on your farm and what training items would need to be included for your employees who are working in these different areas. So for example, if you do use biological amendments of animal origin, so manures or compost, this is coming from the rule, right? That your workers understand the standard operating procedures for properly completing tasks which require managing or handling raw manure or compost, making sure that clothes, boots, and gloves are clean before handling produce, and washing their hands after handling any soil amendments. So that could be a training item that anyone who uses or works with the biological soil amendments is going to receive. So you could do the same thing for training that was related to your agricultural water, any training related to domesticated and wild animals. So these could just be bullet points, right, of what you want your employees to know. It could be, explaining the policy related to any of these things. So just some more to think about in terms of personalizing the training to the different activities that these employees are doing. And it may not be that every employee receives all of this training. It might mean that, on a very small farm, you may have one other person that is involved in record keeping with you. All right, well, what do they need to know? What records do they need to keep? And what resources do they have available to them? So all of these will be personalized for your farm. All right, let's actually talk about record keeping now before we get into some of the examples. So this is directly from the rule, right? These are the records that you must keep in order to be in compliance with subpart C of the training of employees. So you, and I'll explain what is meant by this section, all right? So you must establish and keep records required under this subpart C, in accordance with the requirements of subpart O of this part. Now that is regulatory language if I've ever heard any, but what it means is that subpart C covers the records required for worker training. Subpart O of the produce safety rule is devoted entirely to record keeping, and so it refers to some generalities that apply to all the records kept for the produce safety rule. Okay. And I will explain what those are in just a minute. And remember, anytime that we use the word must, that is coming from the rule, and that is a requirement in the produce safety rule. When we say you should, or it would be a good idea, or you might want to, those are just good suggested practices. But anytime you see that word must, that should be a little light bulb that, oh, I got to pay attention. All right. So in subpart C, you are required to establish and keep records of training that document that you did required training of personnel. Okay. And then in subpart C, it stipulates that your records must include the name and location of your farm, the date of the training, the topics covered, and the persons trained. Now in subpart O, that covers all the record keeping for the produce safety rule, it talks about that records must also be dated and signed or initialed by the person who performed the activity, and reviewed, dated, and signed within, gosh, I've got a lot of typos, I apologize, within a reasonable time after the record is made by a supervisor or responsible party. So these are some things that you would find in subpart O that apply to the records that you keep in subpart C, right? So got to be signed. You can have the record, but if you haven't signed it, initialed it, dated it, then again, it's as good as not being kept. All right, so how do we put this all together? Okay, we know now, I hope, or we're getting closer to understanding what are our required training topics. We've spent some time talking about topics that might be specific to your farm and your workers and how they can be incorporated into a training. And we've talked about record keeping that documents that you are complying. And I'll show you some templates here and some examples in just a minute. So these are the three aspects of your worker training, right? And plus we're going to put it together in a way that is understandable to your workers and that they can comprehend. So there's a great example out there, and I think I shared this with you after the last webinar, but I'm going to explain it in more detail now. This is a very simple, straightforward example. This was developed by K-State. This is their agricultural worker training overview, and it basically hands you a little package that meets the minimum requirements for training. And again, I would want to go over this maybe on an on-farm readiness review or with your inspector, if you're going to just take this and use it, to make sure that it really is going to meet your needs and be help you to be in compliance. But it is really nicely developed, and it's very, very simple. And that's often what we're looking for, because we don't have unlimited time, money, and resources to devote to this, but we want to do it right and we want to be in compliance. So there are 4 parts of this K-State training, and they give you everything you need in one really short and sweet package. So step 1, they have you bring all your workers together to watch a food safety training video, right? So that's good for those visual and auditory learners. You can purchase a video from various sources, and many others are available online for free. And they link you to one from Cornell that's part of the GAPS program. I'm going to show you a few other examples here too. Step 2, they have created a handout, and they have you give everyone a copy of the food safety training for produce workers handout, and it's also part of this curriculum package. It encourages you to review all the information on the handout with your workers, and also be sure to cover any harvesting training requirements with anyone who's doing harvesting. So this handout that they have covers all of those training topics that I mentioned previously that are required to be trained. So step 3, again, this is reaching those different kinds of learners and maybe checking for comprehension. Have a question and answer session with all your trainees. Encourage an open dialogue and a discussion with all your workers. And remember that your workers have a direct impact on the safety of your produce. So that's motivating you, right, as a learner. And so again, we've gotten a video, now we've read and looked over the requirements, and now we have a discussion about it. So again, that is a really simple way to cover some of the bases of those different types of learners. I would add a step 3.1 on there and maybe have workers demonstrate or practice hand washing or cleaning and sanitation or something else like that, so that you can get the benefit of those tactile learners that want to do and practice what they're learning. And then step 4, very, very important, right? They've even completed a worker training attendance sheet. So have everyone complete this sheet documenting the date, topics covered, and the persons trained, and then sign and date by a supervisor, right? So there we go, 1, 2, 3, 4. The whole thing is there. And I've got the link there, and this will also be something that I send out in the follow-up email to all of you. Here are those 4 parts that they include. They've got the video, plus they have a guide for you, which I didn't put up there. That was kind of what is included on this page here to the left is your instructions as the trainer. So they link you to the food safety video from Cornell. They have the handout for your produce workers. And by the way, they have this in English and in Spanish, which is really great, right? If some of your workers speak and read Spanish, then you've got something in a language that they understand. And then they've got your attendance sheet worker training log template right there. Then as a bonus, they have also included some printable handouts and signage for you to put around the work areas, including information about proper hand washing. So really nice little package, ready to go, very easy to use, right? And this would cover those basic minimum requirements of training all workers on personal hygiene and on harvesting. Another one that I found out there that might help you, the Missouri State Department of Agriculture put together a worker training checklist. So this would be just that list of what is required to be trained of your employees, and you could go through and check this off and know that you had trained on the required topics. Again, the principles of food safety and hygiene, right? So talking about microbial contamination, how cleaning and sanitizing works, what do we do if we're working around animals, and it gives you a little tiny box to fill in some of those additional farm specific things. It goes over the personal health and hygiene, right? So recognizing a health condition that could lead to contamination, making sure that you have trained on the sick policy in your farm, the injury policy, and going into hand washing. And I was able to access this through the National Young Farmers Coalition. The link is there. And again, this will be another one that I send out. And I do need to preface that all of these are meant to be tools to support you in your pursuit of compliance with the rule. None of them are going to meet everything. You're going to have to, to still do the work yourself. There are a lot of other resources out there, especially in terms of that initial training on health and hygiene. And the one that was shared from Cornell in the Kansas State example is about 15 minutes long. But I wanted to share this example from Michigan because it's only just about 4 minutes long. And I think it really does a good job of explaining what needs to be included in that initial food safety training. So I'm going to give it a start. And if you don't hear or see anything, let me know in the chat because I can only see it from where I am, okay?
Farm workers can be a source of contamination to fresh produce due to their ability to carry, introduce, and spread human pathogens. This is especially true if farm workers don't follow proper health and hygiene practices. A well-trained workforce is essential to reduce risks and meet food safety regulations. Part 112.21a of the Food Safety Modernization Act states that all farm workers who handle covered produce or food contact surfaces must receive adequate training at least once annually. This training program must cover 3 general topics: the principles of food hygiene and food safety, the importance of health and personal hygiene, including recognizing symptoms of a health condition that could result in direct or indirect contamination of produce, and other standards in FSMA that are relevant to the farm worker's job. Farm workers need to know how to maintain adequate personal cleanliness and when and how to properly wash their hands. You'll also want to orient workers to the bathrooms, hand washing stations, and break areas. 112.129 of FSMA requires that adequate, readily accessible toilet facilities must be provided, and hand washing stations should be in close proximity to these facilities. Additionally, the training should outline the farm policy for blood and bodily fluids, injuries, and illness. Here, you'll want to point out where the first aid kit is, as well as who to report to if a worker were to get injured. As mentioned before, workers should be able to identify symptoms that can be hazards to food safety. These symptoms include diarrhea, fever, sore throat with fever, vomiting, jaundice, and pus-filled open lesions. In cases where farm workers are exhibiting these symptoms, they must alert their supervisors and refrain from handling produce. Other topics to discuss during the training are policies on eating, drinking, and smoking, as well as policies on clothing and jewelry. 112.32 of FSMA states that eating, chewing gum, and using tobacco products is prohibited in an area used for covered activity. This part also requires that gloves are maintained in an intact and sanitary condition, and hand jewelry is removed or covered if it cannot be adequately cleaned and sanitized before handling produce. If a farm worker is responsible for harvest activities of produce covered under the Produce Safety Rule, they have additional training requirements. For one, they should be able to recognize produce that must not be harvested. They also must be able to inspect harvest containers to ensure proper functioning, and either correct any issues with harvest containers or report them to the supervisor. At the end of the training, the date, topics covered, and people trained must be recorded. Along with that, every farm worker needs to sign a form saying that they've read and fully understand the policies. Conducting a farm worker training that is easily understood and remembered by everyone can be challenging. Using visuals or demonstrations in addition to written materials can be effective to accommodate all learning styles. Taking the time to train workers is an investment, but it's critical in order to reduce food safety risks and comply with the food safety laws.
All right, so that was really a 4-minute training for you that covered everything that I've been talking about in 4 minutes. But I hope that that just is another way of exploring what it is that needs to be covered in these trainings. And let me get past it before it starts again. All right. So you might be thinking, well, those are some really useful tools. Do we have anything that is Idaho specific? And yes, we do. And potentially more are in the works. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we have that we can share with you to use that is really Idaho based, and then give you a chance to offer some feedback to us. So first of all, we have 2 tools that can help you in your worker training. We have about an 11-minute video on health and hygiene practices. It covers hand washing, sanitation. It's really good, and it would be more geared to what actually happens on farm, whereas the video I just showed you is really for you about what to train. The video from Cornell also covers a lot of those basic health and hygiene habits. Our Idaho video is specific to the produce safety rule. We've also developed a record-keeping template guide that some of you may have seen. And in that, we have the worker training log where we explain kind of how to use it and what needs to go on it. And then we have blank templates for you to use. So these are both available through both the Idaho State Department of Agriculture and the U of I Produce Safety Program websites. And we would encourage you to use them. You can absolutely use our health and hygiene video as a part of your training. We have it in English and in Spanish with both Spanish voiceover and subtitles. So you can play it twice if you want. If you're looking for additional training on other subjects, we do have a really nice video library of videos that were developed through ISDA and U of I. We've got basically the introduction to FSMA, produce safety record keeping surrounding agricultural water. That one will probably might change with the release of the new ag water rule. We have one that covers the exemptions and qualified exemptions. Like I said, the health and hygiene part 5, that's the one that you might want to use in all of your worker trainings. We do have one that covers equipment, tools, building, and sanitation. So that would be one for any workers that are tasked with maintaining those areas. Again, we have more on water, and we have one on domesticated and wild animals. And those are, again, also available in English and in Spanish, and they're all linked here on our website. So I encourage you to use those as much as you want. If you're also looking for signage and instructions, we do have these hand washing signs that were made by the Idaho State Department of Ag. We can send these to you. They're laminated. We have English and in Spanish. They're about 8.5 by 11. We also have large scale, like 3 by, maybe 3 by, no, more like 2.5 by 3 posters, sorry, that cover visitor policies and things like that. So let us know if you haven't received those already from us. We'd like to get those to you. All right, and I see that Irma would like to get some. I will make sure that you get those if you haven't already. Yeah, so you could put these up and around. You can hand them out at trainings, whatever you would like to do. We would like you to use them. We also have a bunch of stickers that you can put on sinks, on bathroom mirrors that remind about hand washing and the proper steps. So this is something I'm really excited to talk about and potentially have your input on. Some of the things that you saw today are part of a U of I draft template example. This is in the very, very beginning stages. It still needs to be, we need to have permission to develop it. We need to have it reviewed, but it's something that maybe would help you in putting together a worker training. And it's going to follow along similar lines of the Kansas example, but it would be personalized for Idaho. And so it would be combining both your training plan and your worker training log into one complete document that you could use for your record keeping. So it would start out with, the required information that needs to be on. It would help you to identify what kind of training this is, just for your own, your own planning purposes. And then it would have a table of all the different content that would be required, as well as a lot of room for you to put in what particular training you would also want to include for your specific farm. And then we would hope to be able to give you some suggested resources to use, or you would have space to put in what else you used. If you found a handout or a guide that you found really helpful, you could put that in. And that way, if then maybe you're not the one who does the trainings next year, your successor knows how to do the training. So just something that could be used over and over on your farm. So again, we would have information on the required training for all workers, and then we would have areas for that additional training as appropriate that would be used on your farm. And then at the end would be the training log that would be signed and by all your employees, and then reviewed by the supervisor. So, but what I would like to know from you all who are on here is, what would you be looking for in a template like this? If we were to do additional pre-made training presentations, something like that video or a PowerPoint, what would be useful to you? What would save you time and energy and help you to get back to the other things you need to do? Which additional topics come to your front of mind in terms of what you would want to share with your employees? What materials would benefit you most? And keep in mind, a lot of this is going to have to be specific to your farm, including when you're training on your potential policies. But maybe you want to see more examples of sample policies, or if there are some training materials that can be more general, and we could help you with that. If we're to give you materials that were to be personalized, how would you want those to be personalized? Excuse me. And again, what are the languages that you would need these materials to be in? And excuse me, you all gave me some really good ideas last time on webinar part 1. And we have saved those ideas, but if there are others of you that were not on that training that are here today, this gives you an opportunity to share this with us. Oops, let me go back. Okay, so anything you want to put in the chat. And if you don't want that to be seen by everyone, you can chat directly with the host and panelists. You can send us an email after the training. we'd like to continue work on developing that template, but it really needs to be something that would help you. So take a minute to think about those questions and to give us some feedback here. We've got some time, and then we've got plenty of time for question and answer too. And maybe you need to think about it some more, or you want to try out some of what I've shared, and maybe you're fine with what you're using now. So I'll give you another minute to give us some feedback, and then we'll move on. But just know that you can reach out to us anytime. We would really like to be able to assist you in this need. Right, and so maybe it's something that we have some different needs according to the types of crops that we grow or the different ways that these products are handled. So really just reach out and let us know how we could do this. I do want to acknowledge some of the materials that were used in creating today's training and that went into helping me put this together. One is the FDA fact sheet required training for covered farms. And I will include that in the follow-up email. It can also be linked here. And again, it's just a very brief description again of what needs to be trained for every worker on a covered farm. I also found a nice bulletin from Maine Cooperative Extension called Starting a Produce Safety Worker Training Program on Your Farm. And again, this is really going into the nuts and bolts of how do you do a training, what's included, what are some different ways that you might present the information. I thought that this was a really good reference. And again, I would review all of these with your inspector, or think about the accuracy, especially if they're a few years old, but there was a lot of good information in this in general. And then again, that Missouri State Department of Agriculture worker training checklist that I shared with you, just some different ways that this information is organized that might be helpful to you. I found it helpful. So just what's next in our webinar series, we've got one more coming. It's going to be a really good one. I'm very excited. I'm working with a specialist at Michigan State University who is going to be talking to us specifically about managing avian pests or birds. And that will be on April 26th. And some of the questions that we posed to her as she's developing her presentation is determining whether bird presence is a concern on your operation, identifying birds that pose the greatest threat to your crops and your food safety, and then how to take action to effectively reduce bird damage and contamination of covered produce. We're very excited about that one. And then also to reach out and make a new connection with a professional that works in this area. So that'll be on April 26th, same time, same place. If you have registered for all the webinars, you will receive a reminder about that one day prior and then about 1 hour prior. And again, that one will be recorded and handouts will be sent following. So that will bring us to the end of our spring webinar series for this year. If you've missed any of them, we had Effective Worker Training Part 1. Then last week was a replay from 2021, Managing Pests in Enclosed Buildings, which did talk about birds a little bit in buildings, but it also talked a lot about rodents. Then today was Effective Worker Training Part 2. And then next week, It's Not for the Birds, Strategies for Avian Pest Management. And again, if you want to go back, and also if you're looking for additional training tools, We do have our recorded webinars from 2021 and 2020. And 2020 did have 2 on hygiene and sanitation. So those might be worth revisiting. They're an hour long, could be a good training tool. And those are all linked here, and they're on our website. So we really thank you for everything that you do, again, for prioritizing food safety and being with us today. We would really, really appreciate your feedback if you have time. There is the QR code if you would want to just snap it with your phone and go straight to our link. And I'm also going to put that link in the chat here. A few of you have been filling these out every week, and it's very valuable to us to know how we should continue to adapt these webinars, any other topics that we're missing that can support you. We'd really love that feedback. So here is the link to the SurveyMonkey. And again, reach out to us if you have any thoughts or tips on the templates or anything else related to your worker training. And have a wonderful spring, and we will see you next week for our final webinar. Thank you so much.